I will read the land acknowledgement. The city of Thorold is situated on treaty land. This land is steeped in the rich history of the First Nations, such as the Hattiwendarong, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. There are many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island that live and work in Niagara today. The city of Thorold stands with all Indigenous people, past and present, in promoting the wise stewardship of the lands on which we live. And now I'll officially welcome both Chris and Andrew, and we're very grateful that you're here today to give your presentation and answer our questions. And without any further delay, I'm gonna give the floor to you, and it's your show. So
just to
That's
confirm,
great.
are you able to see the presentation?
yes.
Yes. Very good.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. I'm not sure if you can do the slides as individual slides or if you have to show them that way, but it's fine either way. I'm fine with the slides as they are. Thank you very much for inviting Chris and me to share this brief presentation outlining the changes that were introduced into the Ontario Heritage Act as part of the More Homes Built Faster Act 2022, which is widely and commonly known as Bill 23. If you can scroll down to the next slide, the land acknowledgement. We have our own land acknowledgement that we do at the province. Sydney, I'm not sure if you can scroll down just a little bit.
Sorry, is it not showing up, the land acknowledgement slide?
For me, I'm just seeing the I'm still seeing the title slide as the main slide.
Okay,
that's what I'm seeing too.
Let me stop and try again.
Is it possible to display the PDF as a presentation?
Try that. To share it as a presentation.
Yes, that's
This is good.
yes.
Okay.
Okay, so as I say, we have our own land acknowledgement at the province. So we want to take a moment to acknowledge that this presentation has been prepared and is being presented within the lands that are known today as Ontario, which are the home and traditional land of diverse Indigenous peoples. The people of these communities have lived, fished, hunted, and traded throughout these lands for generations and continue to do so today. They have a deep connection to the lands within their traditional territory. This includes cultural heritage, spiritual and sacred sites, artifacts and archaeological sites, built heritage and cultural heritage landscapes. It also includes care and protection for the ancestors and their resting places. Next slide, please. My name is Andrew Jeans and my colleague is Chris Lawless. We are both with the Heritage Policy and Services Unit at the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. Our unit is responsible for the design and development of policy initiatives and development of the legislation and regulations related to the Ontario Heritage Act. We provide technical and advisory services to key partners and stakeholders in the heritage sector. We plan, lead, and manage program initiatives for the heritage sector, working with local municipalities like Thorold, local, provincial, and national heritage organizations. I just wanted to say that before we move to that slide, I have been with the Government of Ontario since 2007, working as a cultural services advisor and as regional advisor in the Eastern region of Ontario, and have worked with many different users of the Ontario Heritage Act in a wide range of situations over that 15 years. Chris Lawless joined the Government of Ontario in 2020 from the private sector, where he worked as a project manager and heritage planner. And Chris has extensive experience in adaptive reuse of heritage buildings, primarily within the context of large-scale residential development proposals. Both Chris and I moved from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport to the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism when the latter ministry took over responsibility for cultural heritage matters in 2022. Next slide, please. So our presentation today will give you an overview of the changes to the Ontario Heritage Act that were introduced in Bill 23. We are going to cover the new requirements to increase accessibility to municipal heritage registers, new requirements in the process for non-designated properties to be included on municipal heritage registers, revision to the process specific to Part 4 designation when a Planning Act application has been submitted, changes to the minimum requirements for new designations under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, changes to the minimum requirements for heritage conservation districts under Part 5, revisions to Part 3.1, which is specific to provincially owned heritage properties, and some housekeeping changes that were introduced in the bill. Next slide, please. The changes to the Ontario Heritage Act were prompted by the More Homes Built Faster Act, which was passed in 2022 with the aim of ensuring that cities, towns, and rural communities in Ontario grow with a mix of ownership and rental housing types that meet the needs of all Ontarians. The changes to the Ontario Heritage Act contained in Bill 23 were designed to help remove potential barriers to housing development and to update how heritage properties are identified and conserved by municipalities and by the province of Ontario, while continuing to conserve key heritage properties that matter most to local communities. And the changes I've already listed in the overview, so I'm not going to repeat that part. I'm now going to hand off the presentation to my colleague, Chris Lawless, to get into the specifics, starting with the Municipal Heritage Register.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Next slide, please. So one of the first changes to the OHA made by Bill 23 is the requirement for municipalities to create an up-to-date version of their Municipal Heritage Register and make it available publicly on a municipal website. This change is intended to increase the transparency around heritage protection. Currently, the statistic is that already more than half of Ontario's municipalities have some version of the register available on their website. The format isn't prescriptive, so the format ranges broadly across the province. Sometimes it's just it's a link from the website to a PDF of the register, which can be downloaded. Other times it's a proper HTML website of the register. We've seen interactive maps where you can sort of scan the map of the municipality and zoom in and find the property, and it'll pull up a window with information. And other times it's a combination of all of these sorts of media pulled together. So really it's up to the municipality to decide how best they want to put the municipal register up on their website. Next slide, please. Next was changes to the notice of intention to designate when there is a Planning Act event. So a new process that was introduced previously in Bill 108, it was meant to encourage designation earlier on in the process, in the planning process. There had been a concern that had been identified that properties that previously had no identified cultural heritage value or interest were suddenly being identified and prepared for heritage designation after a development application had been submitted to the municipality. So this process has been revised to only allow a notice of intention to designate to be issued after a planning application has been submitted. So only when the property has been listed on the register. So it needs to be already a non-designated property that's been listed to then move forward for designation after a planning act event has happened. Next slide, please. And then related to that, to listing of non-designated properties is a change with objections to council. So the change to the process for non-designated properties on the register have been made to allow for decisions to be revisited at any time after a property has been included on the register. The idea for this, or the intention with this, is to increase transparency about why a property has been included on the register and to establish a minimum standard of inclusion. The intent is also to speed up the decision-making process regarding cultural heritage value or interest of a property and whether designation should be warranted for that property. It should be noted that as a municipal heritage council, it's important to know that council is required to consult with you before removing a non-designated property from the register. Next slide, please. Another big change that came with Bill 23 is that the inclusion of non-designated properties on the register now need to meet at least one of the criteria of Ontario Regulation 906. So again, the intention of this is to increase transparency as to the basis for inclusion of the property on the register, standardize the basis of determining cultural heritage value or interest by applying the criteria. So this is the same criteria that's used for evaluating designated properties under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, and now properties contained within a heritage conservation district under Part 5. And it also just raises the threshold for inclusion on the register. Next slide, please. So these are the criteria, the 9 criteria that are included in Regulation 906. So for a non-designated property to be listed, it needs to meet just one of these criteria. And in general, they fall into 3 broader categories. So it's design value, historical value, and contextual value. Next slide, please. And non-designated properties. The inclusion of non-designated properties on registers is a tool that's primarily been used by municipalities as a way of flagging the property as having some level of cultural heritage value or interest, or potential cultural heritage value of interest, but where it wasn't certain. However, listing non-designated properties has also been used to recognize the municipal importance of a property that is provincially or federally owned and exempt from Part 4 designation, as well as been used to monitor properties not known to have sufficient value to be designated at the time of its evaluation. The most significant change to non-designated properties on the register, however, is the requirement to review the list of non-designated properties within 2 years of them being added to the register. The change limits the use of non-designated properties on the Municipal Heritage Register to its primary purpose as an interim measure while evaluation of the property is being completed. So if a notice of intention to designate isn't issued within those 2 years, the property has to be removed from the register, and then it cannot be re-added to the register for another 5 years. So the intent of this change is to encourage the active management of registers and make sure that properties aren't sitting there for decades, not being designated. And now I'm going to pass it back to Andrew for the remainder of the presentation. Back to you, Andrew.
Right. Sorry, could we go to the next slide, please? Right. Thank you. Sorry, I was muted and had not unmuted myself. So Chris has already discussed Regulation 906. This is not new. The regulation has existed since 2006. Previously, it was applied to designated properties, and the requirement was that a designated property meet one of the 9 criteria under the regulation in order to be designated. The standard has now been increased to require that to be designated under Part 4 of the Act, a property must meet 2 or more of the criteria under the regulation. This is intended to make the process more rigorous and to ensure that the properties that are being protected are the most important and significant examples of our cultural heritage. Just for perspective, there are approximately 8,000 designated properties under Part 4. These are individually designated properties across the province. 23% of Ontario municipalities have 100 designated properties or less. The average number of designated properties in a given municipality is 82. And that is obviously thrown off by larger municipalities like Toronto, Hamilton, Ottawa, London, which have much higher numbers, although many small rural municipalities especially may have none. So that brings us to the average of 82. Next slide, please. Now moving to heritage conservation districts, there have been a number of changes that are quite important to how heritage conservation districts are created. These have been introduced to make the process flexible, but also more consistent. So as with individually designated properties under Part 4 of the Act, the standard now requires that for a heritage conservation district to be designated, the district as a whole must meet 2 or more of the prescribed criteria under Ontario Regulation 906. As well, there is now a minimum threshold that 25% of the properties, at least within the district, must meet 2 or more of those same criteria under the Regulation 906. As well, the process for amending or repealing existing heritage conservation district designations and HCD plan bylaws, which did not exist prior to this in the legislation, has been created through a regulatory authority, which basically means that the province can introduce a regulation that sets out the process for how municipalities amend or repeal existing heritage conservation districts. This is not yet in force, but will be coming into force in the future. Again, just to provide a bit of perspective, 54 municipalities across Ontario have at least one heritage conservation district. There are approximately 24,000 properties contained in Ontario's 136 HCDs. 34 of those municipalities have a single heritage conservation district established. Only Toronto with 18, Ottawa with 22, and a handful of others have more than 10 heritage conservation districts. Those are Toronto and Ottawa are the only 2 that have more than 10. A handful of others have multiple districts, but most municipalities that have created a heritage conservation district have only created one. The average number of properties within a typical heritage conservation district in Ontario is approximately 165, although again, there are a couple that are quite large, on the order of 1,000 properties, and then there are a number that are quite small, the smallest being a single property in the city of Toronto, which is Fort York, which is unique in being a single property that is also its own heritage conservation district. Next slide, please. The change to the to introduce the 25% threshold now means that, for example, if a proposed heritage conservation district was to include 100 properties, within the heritage conservation district, 75 of those 100 properties would be perhaps meeting only one of the criteria in that they have contextual value because they define, maintain, or support the character of the district, which is criterion number 7. But 25 of the 100 would also have to meet at least one of the other 8 criteria. Based on the above, that would mean that if you have a heritage conservation district of 100 properties with 25 meeting 2 criteria and 75 meeting only 1, at least 25% of the total number of properties in the district meet 2 or more criteria. It is also possible still to have properties within the district that meet none of the criteria that would be considered non-contributing properties, but simply within the boundary. However, in general, we recommend that districts be created with boundaries such that as many properties as possible meet at least one criterion, and again, at least 1/4 of the properties within the district boundary must meet 2 of the 9. Next slide, please. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to Chris and me speak to these things. I imagine that you will have questions, so you're welcome to ask them at this point. Sorry, oh, well, you have the slides in your packages. So our contact information is on the last slide. If you have any follow-up questions, you're more than welcome after this presentation to get directly in contact with me or with Chris, and we can provide more detailed responses by email. Thank you.
Okay, I actually have a few questions. Eva had actually forwarded them to you, and some of the questions you touched on in your presentation. Thank you very much, by the way, first of all, for taking the time to inform us about this. There are some things that are still not quite clear to me, and they just concern our work in various particular ways. So I just like clarity of how we can go forward. So with regards of the information about our heritage properties being made public on the city's website, that is already the case. The lists are already publicly available, but the description of our designated properties and their historical value is only listed on the Heritage Thorold website, which is then available through a link from the city's website. Is that enough, or does the city have to basically list these more accurate descriptions on their own website?
The city must list them on its own website.
So they basically need to take over that part of Heritage Thorold's website and include it in their own, not just through a link. Okay.
Yes.
The other thing is Thorold's heritage properties have, there's always been extensive descriptions as to their age, their historic and architectural value. The new thing is that the names of the owners and their addresses have to be made publicly available on the city's website. I really don't understand what the purpose of that is. Isn't that a breach of privacy?
Okay, so the purpose of including the names and addresses on the register, and it was always required for designated properties. But the purpose of requiring that is transparency. However, you are correct that there has been identified as a potential conflict between the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Property Act. Unfortunately, Protection of Privacy Act, which is MFIPA. We must really refer you to the City of Thorold's own municipal legal services in terms of advising you on how to reconcile that. We are not at this time able to give you direction on whether or not you should include those names as a matter of MFIPA consistency. I should also say that a number of other municipalities, every municipality that has a register, which is all municipalities that have any designated properties, as well as any that have listed ones as well, is going through the same question around reconciling the privacy requirement under MFIPA with the requirement to include the owner name and address that's in the Ontario Heritage Act. There's quite a spirited discussion going on between municipalities, including municipal heritage planners, who have their own mailing list, and each municipality is going to its own municipal legal services for advice on this. But there's been a lot of concern about this item. A lot of municipal legal services seem to be advising their clients that, in fact, they don't have to require the names and addresses for listed properties to be consistent with MFIPA. Some are advising the opposite way. So we can't give you a definitive answer. We have to get you to get your own lawyers to advise you directly.
Okay. With regards to the owners of non-designated properties, there's a new rule that they have to be informed within 30 days of their property being included in that list. Now, Thorold's non-designated property list has existed for years and years and years. So do we now have to inform all those owners, even though these addresses are publicly available on the city's website, that their home is on that list?
No, it's not retroactive. This is
Okay,
only
good.
for new listings.
Okay, great. Then there was on January 1st, 2025, all listed non-designated properties in our potential heritage property inventory will be taken off that list if they're not designated by then. Now, if there is no prescribed event, no development planned in the neighborhood of a property that cannot be designated in time, and it's now not on that list, can it still be designated after that time?
If there's no prescribed event, then yes.
Okay, good. And all right, I think the rest of my questions was basically answered with that. Now, what about the rest of the members? Does anybody have questions for Chris and Andrew? Councillor?
I see two hands up.
Yes, Councillor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You can go with Sarah first. She had her hand up. And I just want to remind you, Madam Chair, that the little hand on the screen
Oh,
is for
yes,
people. Yeah.
I'm
so,
sorry.
Okay. So let's,
Computer idiot, I'm sorry.
yeah. So if you, Madam Chair, want to allow Sarah to speak, and then
Yes,
I'll
please,
ask my.
Sarah.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. That was great. And Chris, very interesting. And thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this. I'm really getting a lot out of it. I have a couple of questions. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. One of them is, okay, let's say make a decision that 2 out of the 9 criteria, the 906 criteria are met. Is there any retroactive response from, let's say, the government or MCM about this? Because I mean, looking at that list, and certainly I know this came up in a number of the committees I'm on, is, most properties that are identified have probably several, 4 or 5 of the criteria meet, 4 or 5 of the criteria in many different ways. And I just wanted a bit of clarification about that.
Okay, so you're talking about properties that are already designated by bylaw?
No, those that aren't at this point.
Oh, those that aren't.
And in the heritage conservation districts, as you were talking
And in
about,
heritage conservation.
that need 25%, because I really can't imagine, let's say if you're looking at Front Street in Thorold as being an example of that. There are several that are properties that are designated, many that could be. And so easily it would make that threshold of 25%. So I just wanted a bit of clarification about the 906 criteria.
Okay. Well, I mean, it sounds like your situation is pretty straightforward. If you have enough properties that meet 2 of the criteria, or 3 or 4 or more, then you cross the threshold, and there's no obstacle. I don't see that there's certainly the threshold is part of the act now, but the ministry has no additional requirements, or the law has no additional requirements over and above the ones that we've already stated with regards to inclusion in the heritage conservation district. So I think you'd be okay.
Okay, just to clarify though, I do a lot of the reports, or I've done a lot of these reports for Thorold, and certainly in my professional opinion, and member of CAP and so on, or professional member, I see most of the properties I look at have more than 2 of the criteria, almost always. And I'm just curious whether there could ever be a challenge. I mean, council could challenge it, of course. But whether there's a higher authority that could challenge that decision to identify more than 2 criteria.
A property owner could go to the tribunal, the Ontario Land Tribunal, and could advance the claim that their property did not in fact meet criteria. So then it would become a question that would have to be resolved by the tribunal through evidence. The municipality would have to present its evidence showing that the property met 2 criteria or more, and the property owner would be under the obligation to present evidence showing that the property did not in fact meet those criteria. If a report prepared by a heritage professional presents those criteria, presents research showing that property has met those criteria, then I would think that would meet the evidentiary test for the tribunal. Certainly, it should meet the test for municipal council. But generally, the effort is to be rigorous. Like you can't simply say, "Oh, this property meets multiple criteria." You have to show your work. But if you have shown your work, then I think you're fine.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think anyone would want to challenge a property owner. Do a third-party designation. But the other just quick question, thanks for that clarification, is I'm still a bit unclear about this, the deadline. Is it too late to add new or update properties to the registers at this point, or is this something that should
No,
have
it's
done before the first part?
You can continue to add
Okay.
properties. You can continue listing.
Or just
It's
update
just
the
there's a
registry, yeah.
2-year clock now applied to that.
Yeah, because I think probably, when those lists were drawn up here in Thorold, it was done, 20, 25 years ago. And I think probably we all recognize that there are probably other properties that should be included as well, or some removed as well. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Just as a point, many municipalities since the 1970s, so in some cases going back more than 50 years, even before the establishment of the Ontario Heritage Act itself, have had lists of properties. Those lists had no statutory value. They didn't confer any protection on properties. They were simply a reference list that a municipality would maintain. And those lists could contain dozens or even hundreds of properties, but really they were for information purposes only. It was only in 2006 that, and this was after the big changes to the Act in 2005 that everybody remembers, that introduced the ability for municipalities to restrict demolition for designated properties. But in 2006, the ability to include non-designated properties on the register became incorporated into the Act. But by that time, many municipalities had these lengthy reference lists. And so a number of municipalities simply, by resolution of council, adopted those entire reference lists onto their register. Some municipalities chose not to do that. Some municipalities weeded out properties from their list that were considered no longer, either the property no longer had any buildings on it or no longer had any value for one reason or another. There is nothing in principle that stops any municipality from continuing to maintain a list that has no statutory value, that has no statutory force. The only thing is that if it's going to be formally included on the municipal register, it can now only be included for a period of up to 2 years. And after those 2 years have expired, it cannot be re-included as a non-designated property for 5 years. Rather than having listed properties on the register be something that can sit for an indefinite period of time, it now becomes a short-term interim measure for long-term inclusion on the register with no clock for taking them off. You have to designate either under Part 4 or Part 5. But as I say, there's nothing to stop a municipality like Thorold from maintaining an informal list of properties that are perhaps under consideration for designation, or are considered to meet one criterion under the regulation, or are otherwise of interest to the Municipal Heritage Committee, to the municipality, but have no statutory protection or statutory recognition.
So if it's removed, or if it's the period 2 years has elapsed, then it has to be off that list for 5 years.
That's correct.
Okay.
It can be designated within that 5-year period.
Yeah, if it
so
isn't. Okay.
Yeah, but if you want to re-include it as a listed property, you have to wait 5 years.
Okay, that's important to know. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You have your hand up, Councillor. Do you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Andrew and Chris, for the presentation. Very informative. Thank you for taking the time. My question actually ties over a little bit with Ms. King's question as well, and it's focused on heritage conservation districts. So Thorold has not only neighborhoods, residential neighborhoods, but also a downtown that is rich in heritage buildings, properties. And so my question is, should a heritage conservation district meet the requirements and in fact become designated, how does that affect the other properties that are there?
Sorry, so if the properties are included in the district,
Yes, so let's take the main street, for example.
yeah,
Multiple heritage buildings. If we call Front Street a heritage conservation district, what happens to the buildings that are not heritage buildings? Can they be changed, modified? Do they have to fit in? That sort of thing.
yeah. First of all, when you establish a heritage conservation district, you are not preventing buildings within that district from being modified or changed. You are only creating a framework, a heritage conservation district plan, which guides how those changes happen. And those changes are still subject to a decision of council. So the property owner needs to get approval from council to make alterations. Council does have the ability to delegate some of that approval authority down to staff for routine things. If a property does not have, does not meet one or two or more of the criteria for cultural heritage value interest, but falls within the boundary, it would be considered a non-contributing property, and the Heritage Conservation District Plan would provide for those non-contributing properties by saying that they would be, exempt from certain requirements for changes. Now, if an owner of a non-contributing property proposed to demolish the building on that property and build something new, that would still be subject to design guidelines and requirements of the Heritage Conservation District Plan, so that new construction within the district would be required to be consistent with the overall values of the district.
Mm-hmm.
However, if the owner of a non-contributing property wanted to make alterations to their property, like say changing the windows or residing or doing something like that, in general, the plan would not have guidelines for that property, and there could be specific exemptions which would say that those alterations to non-contributing property could be made without a heritage permit from the municipality. As well, for any property, whether it's contributing or non-contributing, routine changes like repainting, basic landscaping, things like that, can be exempted from the requirements for heritage permits, so that even if a property is of considerable heritage value and the owner wishes to simply do routine maintenance, that can be exempted from the requirements for a heritage permit. So there's a lot of flexibility in a Heritage Conservation District Plan, both for properties that contribute to the district and properties that don't contribute to the district. The overall idea is that any property that falls within the district, if it has a change that is going to affect the overall value of the district, then that would need to have a permit. But if it's not going to affect the overall value of the district, then it wouldn't.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Wynn, you have a question.
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. Building off this district area, I wanted to just understand what constitutes a district area. Like, do we define the parameters as long as that 25% threshold? Okay, and then okay, great.
Yeah.
So just wanted to clear that up. Mm-hmm.
Council sets the boundary. It's generally mapped out. These days, it's usually done through GIS, Geographic Information System. You're identifying the specific parcels that fall within the boundary. It's defined by council, and becomes part of the bylaw designating the district.
Okay.
I have one more, if I may, Madam To circle back to the non-designated properties, and this might be like an open floor question. I know we have an index publicly available for potential designations. It's from 2016. Is that like an official, is that officially on our registry as non-designated properties, or is this that informal list that we don't need to do anything with, and it won't, you know, become abolished in 2 years' times if we don't designate?
That depends on whether it was adopted by council by resolution. So I don't know the answer to that, but if you have properties that are not designated under Part 4 or in a heritage conservation district, council would have had to specifically pass a resolution saying that those properties were included on the register under the specific section and subsection is 27.3 of the Ontario Heritage Act. So the resolution would have to refer to that. If there is no resolution of council referring to that and saying that those properties are included on the register, then they would be an informal non-statutory list. But if council has passed a resolution saying that those properties are included on the register, then they're subject to all of these requirements that we've talked about, including the 2-year clock.
Does anyone on the call know if that's the case? Okay, I'll find out.
Joe,
Yeah,
you have a question?
your clerks should be able to help you with that.
Joe?
Okay, I want to go back to the Heritage District conservation. What we're talking about, like on our Front Street area, we do have, I'm thinking maybe 4 designated properties on it. Some of them are new builds. Some are nice old buildings that I'm sure there's a lot of history to them. But if we were to set a boundary where we're including a lot of historical elements that no longer exist above ground because we had first and second Welland Canal that cut through the back of our downtown section. Now, we know approximately where the locks are buried. We do have one exposed over in Beaver Dams Park that we're in the process of designating it. Now, there's a lot of significance to this this pathway, so to speak. There's 2 buried locks, but at the time in the 1800s, there was a cotton mill there, cement works. We have an idea of where these buildings exist. Does that play a role in justifying the designation of a heritage district, even though they're not physically there, but we can mark them through signage?
So I don't know if Chris wants to answer this one. I've answered a lot of questions. My
understanding is that, you know, as part of a district in HCD, that you would only be including built structures above ground, and that what you're describing are sort of archaeological issues that may arise that would be studied if there is perhaps developments within the district that may affect those archaeological resources, and that would trigger you know, stage 1, 2, 3, or 4 archaeological assessments that would then investigate whether or not the remains of these locks or foundation walls are there. But my experience, I've never seen a heritage conservation district plan that includes, you know, underground, non-visible elements as part of the designation. Andrew, do you have any insights into it?
I just wanted to ask a question so I'm clear. The land where the former canals were, where these former industrial properties were, is that private property? Is it municipally owned property? Is it parkland? What status does that land have currently?
Municipal, city-owned property.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's no particular obstacle to incorporating open spaces, green spaces, street spaces, things like that into a heritage conservation district. Like they can fall within the boundary, and if they're municipally owned, then you don't have any concern around owner objections. So you could incorporate them into the boundary. The thing is that, as Chris says, the Heritage Conservation District plan would primarily guide new construction or changes to existing built elements. It could include guidance with regards to some landscaping aspects, but it wouldn't guide archaeological investigations. So if things are buried beneath the surface, those are subject to a different part of the Act, and are subject to their own requirements. That's part 6 of the Act, which deals with archaeology, which is stuff underground. But as far as commemorative aspects like signage, landscaping, certainly any new construction that would take place, including municipal public works like pathways, those could be addressed in the Heritage Conservation District plan.
So we would be looking at possibly that section being an interpretive park.
Sure, and it could be incorporated into the Heritage Conservation District in that capacity. And again, the plan would have to be designed such that it incorporated recommendations for any future changes, recognizing that land was open space or parkland.
Okay, thank you.
But again, if the municipality wanted to erect a gazebo, the municipality wanted to put in a bicycle path or some other kind of facilities, or conduct any other public works within that area, that could be subject to the requirements of the Heritage Conservation District plan.
Sarah.
Hi, yeah, sorry, just as to Joe's question, and this is just a technicality that I'm not clear on myself, is that, under the PPS, that area would be considered having archaeological potential, which is, I think, what you're referring to, but in terms of like the Ontario toolkit, the Heritage Toolkit, these would be considered relict heritage assets, right? As per, let's say, cultural heritage landscape. So I wonder if, there doesn't seem to be any legislation governing this, but it seems to me that in itself, because you come at it from two different directions, that area should be protected. But I don't know if there's any legislation guiding that. That's the first part of it. And I'm thinking about, let's say there is a building has been placed on top of, let's say, lot 24 of the Second Canal, one of them in downtown Thorold. You could not, let's say, you could not remove it and then dig a foundation on top of that former law, could you?
You could, if it met all of the requirements of the Ontario Heritage Act under Part 6, which would mean that you would have to conduct an archaeological assessment. So that would require retaining a licensed archaeologist who would do the initial assessment. And the initial assessment is done generally through desk research only. It's about going through old maps, old documentation, determining whether or not there's further potential. Follow-up assessments, stage 1 is the initial assessment under Ontario's framework, and that's the sort of the paper desk research. But follow-up assessment could involve excavations, test pits, and then even further excavation, which is 2, 3, and 4 are the stages. So if there was proposal to do major disturbance to the ground, including excavating a new foundation, that would most likely require up to a full stage 4 archaeological assessment to identify if there are any artifacts beneath the surface. The general distinction here is the ground level. Anything that goes on beneath ground level is subject to the requirements of Part 6 of the Act and has to be done by licensed archaeologists following those requirements. Stuff that happens above ground level is subject to Parts 4 and Part 5, But when you get into situations where there's disturbance below ground, then you may have to meet all of the requirements. You would be subject to potentially requirements for a heritage permit for construction, but also for requirements for archaeology.
Okay. Yeah, I think yes, but in terms of the provincial policy statement and let's say the identification of cultural heritage landscapes, there's no binding legislation. These are just, I mean, I suppose the PPS, that's planning, right? So
yes.
Well, that would that hinder, or you would have to go through council, of course, and have to.
No, it would still have to go through council.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, what would happen is that the City of Thorold's official plan would have to have policies that would be consistent with the provincial policy statement. Those policies would guide development under the Planning Act for those areas. So they would be specifically identified in the official plan, and then any development or change that was taking place would have to follow the Planning Act process. But if it was also identified as part of a heritage conservation district, or if it was individually designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act, then it would, in addition to the Planning Act requirements, it would have the Heritage Act requirements that it would have to meet. And as a cultural heritage, if it was identified as a cultural heritage landscape, it could be protected under Part 4 or Part 5, because cultural heritage landscapes can be protected under Part 4 or Part 5. Although, again, what you're identifying there are the things that would be visible above the surface. So if there's no evidence, if there are no attributes, if there's no physical evidence to show what makes that landscape valuable above the surface, it's difficult to justify designating it as a cultural heritage landscape, unless you're designating it for spiritual significance. There are situations where cemeteries, for instance, or battlefields that have no visible evidence that are connected with them are nonetheless designated. But again, you're getting into tricky territory because it's difficult to regulate change to things that can't be seen, unless you're talking specifically about managing archaeological resources, which would be dealt with through that separate section of the Act.
The only comment there is that certainly in central, along where the canal was, you can see the topographic evidence of the fact that, you can see there's a sunken area that follows pretty much the line of the first and second canals. So, I mean, I guess that would be sufficient without having
absolutely.
Actually,
absolutely. If there's evidence of the canal in the landscape, in the form of a change in the topography, in the form of like a remnant, like change in elevation, that can be formally identified. Okay. That can be identified in a Part 4 bylaw. It can be identified in a heritage conservation district plan and say, the visible path of the former canal is a heritage attribute of the landscape.
Okay. Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So if there are no further questions, then I would like to thank both Andrew and Chris again for being with us today and giving us the opportunity to ask our questions and listen to your presentation. And then my next thing will be to adjourn this meeting and call another one immediately afterwards. Sarah, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye. Sarah, if you have time, you can join us. But I leave it up to you. I know you're busy. So this meeting is adjourned at 11:03. And now I'm going to call our regular monthly meeting
Perfect. I'm just gonna